Number blank, Hackham Terrace, Swindon. The ghastly screams on the staircase. Last December, I journeyed up from Cornwall, as usual, to the annual concert given by my old school, Clifton College. And at the subsequent house supper, I made the acquaintance of several OCs who were considerably my junior in point of age. We chatted together for a long time, and in the course of our conversation, touched upon the superphysical. You couldn't have a better authenticated instance of a haunted house, one of my young friends remarked, than that of number blank, Hackham Terrace, Swindon. Isn't that so, Nielsen? You come from Swindon. Nielsen agreed. I know the people who live there, my informant Jarvis continued, and they have seen and heard the phantasm over and over again. What form does it take? I asked. A shrieking woman's. Like the ghost of Tahiti, I ejaculated. I had never heard of the ghost of Tahiti, Jarvis rejoined, but I cannot conceive anything more gruesome than the Hackham Terrace apparition. Let me tell you some of Mrs. Belmont's experiences. You must know the house is quite new, the Belmonts being the first tenants, and that nothing has been discovered so far that can in any way account for the hauntings. To proceed, about a month after they had taken the house, everyone was aroused in the middle of the night by a succession of the most unearthly screams, coming, so it seemed, from the basement of the house. For some seconds no one ventured out of the rooms, and then, Mrs. Belmont very pluckily taking the lead, the other members of the house followed her downstairs. Arriving at the commencement of the passage leading to the kitchen, they all saw an indefinable black object lying on the ground. Frozen to the spot with horror, the Belmonts watched the thing slowly rise, developing as it did, until it assumed the appearance and dimensions of a gigantic naked woman. But what was so inconceivably horrid about her was the face. She had no eyes, their places being filled in with ordinary flesh. Confronting them for some moments in silence, she suddenly and without the least warning assumed a horizontal position in midair, dematerialized, and passed through the wall in the guise of a rectangular mass of pale blue light. Could anything be more ghastly? It has parallels in the luminous woman known as Proctor's ghost, Wellington, near Newcastle, and in a house also new in Portishead. Can you tell me any further experiences there? Yes, Jarvis rejoined. One of the servants was breaking coal in the cellar one evening when the hammer was unceremoniously snatched from her hand, the candle blown out, and a blue tattooed arm thrust so roughly against her face that one of her front teeth was actually loosened. She screamed, and the arm vanished. Still another incident. One of the Belmont boys, Percy, was preparing to get into bed one night when something caught him sharply by the foot, and looking down, he saw to his surprise a large hairy hand encircling his ankle. He particularly noticed the nails, which, though filbert in shape, were excessively long and dirty. Mumbling a prayer, the first that came into his mind, he emphasized it with a violent kick. He could not say which produced the desired effect, the prayer or the kick, but the hand let go its hold, and the next moment a shapely mass of blue, suddenly rising from the bed and hovering for the briefest duration of time on a level with his eyes, disappeared through the ceiling. On another occasion, when Mrs. Belmont was in the conservatory watering flowers, one of the pots behind her suddenly fell to the ground with a crash. She turned round and found herself confronted by a blue face that occupied the spot where the pot had stood. Too dismayed and startled to even think of escape, she stood rooted on the spot, gazing at the evil thing in open-mouthed horror. What was it? Though resembling a man in contour and features, its expression was too thoroughly bestial to belong to anything human. The eyes, deep sunken and lurid, leered malignantly at her, whilst the mouth was distorted into a diabolical grin. The apparition had no body. Mrs. Belmont is of the opinion she might have stayed there till doomsday had not the unexpected arrival of the gardener scared the thing away. It disappeared as he entered the greenhouse door, and its place was once again taken by the flower pot. Mrs. Belmont had another unpleasant experience only this week. As she was crossing the landing to her bedroom one morning, someone seized her by the shoulders and, pulling her violently backwards, threw her on the floor. She was then gripped by the throat so firmly that the impressions of the fingers could be seen the next day, and on looking up she encountered the same awful face she had seen in the conservatory. The hateful thing was now in full possession of a body which, blue and hairy, accorded well with the strangely animal expression in its eyes. Mrs. Belmont was too fascinated and horror-stricken to struggle, and she thinks she would have undoubtedly have been strangled had not the succor once again arrived at the most opportune moment. Her rescuer this time was Bruce, a very pugnacious Irish terrier. Nothing daunted, and contrary to one is led to expect from the generality of psychic tales, Bruce flew at the figure. The phantom immediately dissolved into a blue vapor and vanished. I could enumerate many other occasions in which similar occult phenomena occurred in the house. Sometimes the eyeless woman would be seen gliding down the staircase or heard screaming in the passages. At other times the blue man would pounce upon his unsuspecting victims out of some dark sequestered corner, or frighten them to the verge of a fit by simply peering at them through a door or a window. The manifestations always terminate in a blue vapor. This house, you say, was quite new, I observed. Jarvis nodded. Then the history of the hauntings, I replied, must either be in some piece of the furniture or in the ground itself. The blue man with the bestial expression in his face and tattoo marks on his arms suggests to me the probability that he is a phantasm of an ancient Celt. Possibly he was a suicide or murderer. Possibly he was neither, but it is merely tied to this earth by his animal propensities. In either case, he would hover around the place of his burial, and his naturally ferocious spirit would be rendered doubly ferocious at being disturbed. The woman, of course, may have been someone associated with him in his life. The lack of eyes, the sign of some dreadful depravity in her nature. Appendix to number blank, Hackham Terrace, Swindon. At Jarvis's request, I related to him the story of the screaming woman of Tehedi, taking from a collection of remarkable narratives on the certainty of supernatural visitations from the dead to the living, impartially compiled from the works of Baxter, Wesley, Simpson, etc. I chose this tale as the least hackneyed and best authenticated of the many accounts I have heard of similar occult phenomena. It is given the original text, the extracts being taken from the letter of one S.W. to his friend Charles. I had occasion one day, he writes, to visit the hamlet of Barnley, some miles distant from Tehedi, where I was staying with some relations. My stay was unexpectedly prolonged till a late hour, and having promised to be at home before night, I was compelled to set out on my return, much after the period at which it ought to have been commenced. Part of my road lay through a thick and lonely forest, and I confess that the task of traversing it would have been more agreeable at an earlier opportunity. My spirits were affected from some indefinable cause, and the chill, dark journey I was preparing to take did not tend to raise them. I swallowed a hasty cup of coffee with my friend, shook him cordially by the hand, and mounting my horse, was soon at a considerable distance from his house. I was approaching the verge of the forest, and had just entered a narrow outlet from it, when I heard the roll of distant thunder, and felt the wet and heavy droppings of a copious rain. Having scarcely a league further to travel before I reached home, I determined to urge my horse to the utmost, and escape, if possible, by his speed from the impending storm. He broke at once into a gallop, when I struck him with a spur, but had scarcely gone 100 paces before I was thrown from the saddle by his abrupt stopping, and pitched with the greatest violence to the ground. I lay stunned for a few moments by the fall. The first thing that brought me to a sense of my situation was a hoarse scream, uttered by some person who breathed close to my ear. The rein, which I had continued to grasp in falling, was at that moment torn violently from my hand. I heard the noise of my courser's hoofs as he startled back. The scream was repeated, and something rushed past me that clanked as it went like a horseman's heavy iron-cased saber. I sprang up from the earth and threw out my hands to ascertain if any individual were actually passing, but the avenue was so narrow that I touched the hedges on each side of it, and felt instantly convinced that nothing human could have gone by. A recollection now flashed upon me that there is a tale of extreme horror connected with this part of the forest, and in spite of the principles which I summoned to my aid, it was in a mood of mingled desperation and amazement that I reflected on the circumstances with which my memory supplied me. The infirmary of Tehedi about 20 years ago contained a female patient who was known by the name of Martha, and had been admitted to that asylum at the instance of a stranger. He stated himself to be her husband, and assured the director of the institution with an appearance of the deepest sorrow that she labored under a lunacy of the most stubborn sort, which nothing but the most severe discipline attributed to his house was likely to abate. He advanced a large sum for the maintenance of this unhappy creature, saw her lodged in one of the strongest cells of the establishment, and, having recommended an unsparing use of the scourge, thought proper to depart. His meaning was not misunderstood. The shrieks of poor Martha were heard day and night in the vicinity of her dungeon, and suspicion soon prevailed that she was being sacrificed to the cruelty of her merciless keepers. An investigation of the case was proposed by some humane and spirited people, but a calamity of the most awful kind put the stop to their endeavors. Martha was found dead on the borders of the forest, at the very spot I have described to you, a piece of ragged arm being clenched in her grasp, with which she had torn and gashed her throat in a dreadful manner. The escape of this wretched being was never well explained, and hints were dropped that she had not left the prison alive. Her bloody and mangled remains excited a strong sensation among those who inspected them. Marks of the chain and the whip were conspicuous in every part of her body, and long tufts of her thin gray hair were glued together by the stream that had issued from a deep fracture in her head. The tokens of suicide, however, were undeniable, and the remains of the poor maniac were in consequence buried near the place where they were found. This occurrence had scarcely ceased to be the subject of conversation when the whole town of Teodi was agitated by the events of a yet more appalling manner. Hoarse screams were heard in the still dark hours of the night, and a pale, bloodless face was seen pressing against several of the chamber windows. Fraud or delusion were naturally suspected in a business of this nature, and the most scrutinizing inquiries were made into the evidence on which it rested. No detection took place, and the screams soon became so frequent that not a person continued to question their existence. It was midnight when I reached home, exhausted by anxiety and fatigue, and being provided with a key to my apartments, the people of the house had not waited up to receive me. I drew off my boots and upper coat, added preliminary to the act of undressing, and seated myself in a large antique chair, from which, when divested of my clothes, I usually stepped into bed. Here I fell asleep owing to excessive weariness, and may the next slumber that is likely to end in so horrible a way be never broken. A dream was full upon me of blood and death. The shrieking maniac flitted through my brain in 1,000 forms, and seemed at one time to stand before me brandishing a sword of fire. The next moment I lay benumbed, as it were, in my seat, while the maniac advanced from a dark corner of the room, bearing in her right hand a human skull, replete with some poisonous sort of drink. This horrible potion was lifted to my lips, which seemed to shut in vain against it, the long bony fingers of the phantom being thrust into my mouth so as to force a passage for her accursed mixture. It trickled down to my very heart in slow, cold drops, then lodged there, it seemed, by a sudden transition, to burn and glow like flames of Etna. Spellbound as I was, such extreme agony passed my powers of endurance. I uttered a frantic cry and sprang up from the chair, darting towards the hag by whom my torment was inflicted. The glare of her red eyes grew stronger as I advanced, and a lean, sallow arm was put out to repel me. Fearing the detested touch, I hastily drew back. Some article of furniture intercepted me. I fell and was plunged from the floor into a chasm from which opened through the floor. The shock of this awoke me, and the first proof I obtained of my actual perception was the sound of that hoarse scream which a few hours before had been uttered in the forest. The scream was repeated, and it seemed to issue from the windows. I heard the casement flap, as if a strong wind were shaking it, and though my sinews shrank and withered at the noise, yet I staggered to this window as fast as my feet would carry me. A ray of light flashed in, and as I reached it, and there, pressed close against the glass, I saw the same pale, bloodless visage that had been already figured to you. Maddened by the sight, I clenched my hand and drove it fiercely at the apparition. Its lips quivered, and the scream rang again through the apartment. I was found next day without sense or motion, my hand dreadfully cut, and the window shivered to pieces. The end. Park House, Westminster. The Cavalier's Ghost. I was always a very strong-minded man, and until the time about which I am going to speak, always ridiculed the idea of ghosts. You must know that about 2 years ago, I went to a lodge at an ancient house in Westminster, where nothing remarkable happened to me for about 3 months. And then, on a night in November, too well do I remember it, I saw such an appalling sight as I have never beheld. Even were I starving tomorrow, I would not again enter that room, no, not for 1,000 pounds. I had been to the theatre, and on my way home had drunk a single pint of porter, so that no doubt of my sobriety can exist for a moment. My room was on the second story of a house that, I should suppose, had weathered well nigh 400 years, and was in former days an isolated habitation. The room, surrounded by a wainscoting of oak to the height of 5 feet, was very lofty, and even in the lightest days, owing to the narrowness of the windows, was extremely gloomy. As I said before, I had returned from the theatre, and the snuff of a candle which I extinguished on getting into bed had not ceased to emit its disagreeable effluvia before I beheld, my blood freezes when I think of it, a young man dressed in the habit of days gone by, gliding through the wainscot on the opposite side of the apartment to where I lay. I was completely paralyzed, trembled violently in every limb, and the perspiration fell in torrents from my brows. I felt for some time as if every nerve was cut asunder and every sense benumbed. I exerted myself to speak, but in vain. My tongue cleaved to the roof of my mouth, and I was obliged to remain a horror-stricken and inactive spectator of the scene before me. The apparition remained for nearly 10 minutes, which was ample time for me to convince myself that it was no idle chimera of a diseased imagination that stood before me. Yet although it remained so long a time, I could not command sufficient resolution to challenge it or summon anyone to my aid, for I felt as though deprived of all energy, and in fact I was so during the whole time of its visit, though my sense of perception and consciousness were painfully acute. The expression of the countenance was particularly mild, and the rich dark locks falling about the forehead and shoulders, and the mustachios of the same hue, showed in horrid relief against the ashy, chilling, and livid hue of the face. He wore a doublet of some kind of chocolate color, richly embroidered with gold lace, full loose breeches of a yellow leather, ornamented uniformly with the doublet, and from each was suspended a bunch of ribbon, adorned with a metal tag, reaching down nearly to the broad and drooping tops of his light russet boots. A large traveling coat of dark blue cloth reached from the shoulders down to the heels, hanging in full folds over the left arm, which was extended towards the fireplace of my apartment. Whilst I was gazing at him in stupid astonishment and terror, he raised his right hand, and lifting from his head his broad sable-feathered hat, discovered to my agonizing sight a deep and bloody wound in the center of the forehead. This action he then followed up with sighs and gesticulations which, although I could not clearly understand, were apparently intended to warn me of some impending danger. Harrowing as the sight was to my feelings, it was a mere nothing to what I suffered when I beheld him advance, slowly and almost imperceptibly, towards the spot where I lay, and fixing his dark piercing gaze upon me for nearly a minute, hold me in a more painful and horrid inactivity than that which the basilisk is said to hold its victims. Although I knew from the expression in his eyes he wished me to speak, and much as I desired to hear from him some of the mysteries attached to the superphysical world, I could not articulate a sound, a phenomenon which I have since learned invariably happens to psychists at the crucial moment. At length he retired towards the wainscot, and raising both his hands in the attitude of prayer, remained apparently wrapped in deep contemplation for nearly 3 minutes, then suddenly disappeared, sinking into the floor at the bottom of the wainscoting. As you may well suppose, I did not close my eyes that night, and demanded to settle my account, for I determined in my own mind never to re-enter the house which was visited in so superhuman a manner. With astonishment on his countenance, he received the amount of my rent, at the same time inquiring what had caused his sudden aversion to my apartment. I answered evasively, and as I left him I thought I observed a kind of lurking consciousness of something wrong in his countenance, which led me to surmise he was fully aware of the mysterious visits of the apparition, and so it proved in the end, for, happening to meet him one day in the park, I inveigled him into confessing that it was reported in the neighborhood that the house, and particularly the room in which I slept, was haunted by the troubled spirit of a young Cavalier of King Charles II's days, said to have been murdered there, and, he added, during the time he had kept the house, no less than 9 people had left the apartment on account of the disturbances. He had concealed this from me, he concluded, preferring that I might add one more to the list of lodgers scared away by the supernatural vision. The end of Some Haunted Houses in England and Wales.